These are dangerous days for Europe. Russia has relentlessly massed troops in and around Ukraine, in the biggest military buildup since the Cold War. We do not know what will happen, but the risk for conflict is real.
On February 19, 2022, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, was at the Munich Security Conference. He had just received the Ewald von Kleist Award for his achievements as Secretary General from Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission. The who's who of world diplomats had gathered in Munich to discuss the most pressing security issues of the day. But one issue overshadowed all others.
The current crisis is about more than Ukraine. There is much at stake. Relations between NATO and Russia, European and transatlantic security, and ultimately the question of how we wish to organize relations between states.
Just a few days later, on February 24, 2022, Russia began its invasion of Ukraine. For the past 2 years, NATO allies have rallied behind Ukraine, but the path forward is not always straightforward.
Now we know that this is likely to be a longer-term conflict that requires this kind of institutional long-term commitment, not just from NATO delivering the coordination, but allies need to be delivering multi-year commitments.
Being in NATO means that you are secure. And I think 24th of February 2022 has clearly shown that. If you are in NATO, the chances that you're going to be attacked by an adversary or an aggressor are much slimmer.
We need to see our European allies step up their efforts, not merely in terms of capability, but now capacity, because large-scale combat is back.
This year, NATO members will commemorate the 75th anniversary of the alliance at the Washington Summit in July. Anniversaries are traditionally a time of celebration of past accomplishments and a reflection on pivotal moments. After over 7 decades, the alliance faces a pivotal moment yet again, with Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine at its doorstep. Since its founding in 1949, the alliance has grown from 12 founding members to 32 member countries, most recently welcoming Sweden just a few months ago. Many countries, including Ukraine, are still eager to join. In this series, we are going on a deep dive into why NATO, 75 years in, remains an integral security guarantor for the United States, for Europe, and for those still waiting for membership. Throughout this series, we'll be hearing from people who have dedicated their careers to serving, understanding, and educating about NATO's mission, its work, and its role in preserving transatlantic security. And we will hope to answer the same question Eisenhower asked in 1951.
The question that confronts us is whether we can achieve, by individual and collective cooperation, adequate defense of our way of life.
I'm Natalia Gopitnik, Director of Communications at the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
I'm Rick Landgraf, Senior Fellow in the Institute's Eurasia program. And this is The Ties That Bind.
NATO at 75 and beyond. Thanks for joining us.
Maintaining political cohesion on the issue of continuing the flow of Western military aid to Ukraine is a pressing concern for NATO and will be at the top of the agenda when the heads of state and government of the 32 allies meet in Washington from July 9th to the 11th. In light of the outcome of the European parliamentary elections earlier this month, in which far-right and Russia-curious parties in France and Germany made moderate gains, though less so than had been anticipated, there's good reason for concern. While support for Ukraine will likely remain stable in the short term, what lies ahead is less certain. French President Emmanuel Macron has called for snap parliamentary elections, which could lead to a government led by the right-wing and Russia-friendly National Rally. France has thus far been an ardent backer of Ukraine. Macron has even floated the idea of deploying French troops on Ukrainian soil, though it is unclear in what specific capacity. And any further pro-Ukrainian efforts at the European Union level would require French leadership and the support of the French National Assembly. Moreover, with less than 6 months to go before the U.S. presidential election, there is a 50-50 chance that Donald Trump will return to the presidency. This could cast serious doubt over the future of the U.S. leadership in orchestrating Western military support for Ukraine, if not the future of the U.S. role in NATO altogether. While as both a candidate and president, Trump has frequently attacked NATO and fixated on the issue of unequal transatlantic burden sharing. Earlier this year, he indicated that he would encourage Russia to, quote, do whatever the hell they want to NATO members that are, quote, delinquent, presumably in terms of defense spending. With these developments in mind, supporting Ukraine in its ongoing fight against Russia as the war drags on into its third year will no doubt be on the minds of national leaders and policymakers at the North Atlantic Council summit meeting in Washington. To understand what NATO's role in the Ukraine war has been up to this point and where it might be heading, I sat down with someone intimately familiar with the alliance, its bureaucracy, the deal-making, the sometimes arm-twisting, and the inevitable compromise necessary for an organization that is premised on consensus-based decision-making. Dominik Jankowski is a Polish security expert, diplomat, and think tanker who currently serves as the Deputy Ambassador of Poland to NATO, and previously served as a policy advisor in the office of the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg.
NATO from the beginning had a very clear goal, which is, defending Allied territory and making sure that there is no spillover effect from Russia against Ukraine into Allied territory. And I think when you look at that, NATO has succeeded in that role. I mean, the war basically, remained between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, the NATO deterrence and defense policy worked. But of course, apart from that element, NATO gradually looked into how collectively we can, as the alliance, support Ukraine. And, in all frankness, at the beginning in 2022, there was a lot of reluctance what NATO's role should be. There were a lot of discussions about, any potential escalatory elements that this NATO's direct support to Ukraine can cause, which could potentially lead to a direct Russia-NATO war. So since then, NATO has basically concentrated on providing non-lethal support to Ukraine through so-called comprehensive assistance package, which basically is an instrument to which allies contribute financially and in kind, which covers, elements from medical support to counter-drone measures. But NATO, until right now, is not providing direct military support to Ukraine. That's done through the coalitions under the U.S. leadership, such as UDCG.
Just to be clear for our listeners, the comprehensive assistance package, as you mentioned, was a structure that preceded Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It was stood up a few years back, well before the full-scale invasion. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. The comprehensive assistance package was agreed in 2016 at NATO summit in Warsaw, and since 2016 has been used to support Ukraine. So in 2022, when Ukraine caught also NATO by surprise, we had limited instruments at our disposal. So one of the instruments that existed and worked was comprehensive assistance package. So we basically decided back then in 2022 that we will boost this instrument and make it specifically designed to help Ukraine in a short term. But as I said at the beginning, only through non-lethal support. So basically, this instrument is still functional. There are multiple allies are contributing financially to CAP. In fact, there are also partners of NATO financially contributing to CAP, such as Australia or Japan. So this instrument is still there, but a lot of allies are saying this is not enough. We need to go one step further and try to do things that we have not done since.
For our audience, and talk a little bit more about the NATO-Ukraine relationship, and specifically, why a country like Ukraine wants to join NATO. And in many ways, Ukraine is in a position very much like Poland or the Baltic states, where there's a history of Russian and Soviet aggression, and these countries seek more security, seek a security guarantee as afforded through Article 5 of NATO membership. Can you speak a little bit about what NATO membership means for your country, Poland, or what it means for a country like Ukraine?
Being in NATO means that you are secure. And I think 24th of February 2022 has clearly shown that. If you are in NATO, the chances that you're going to be attacked by an adversary or an aggressor are much slimmer. Some people are saying NATO is not perfect. Sure, it's not perfect, but it gives you that security guarantee. And this is why, for example, Poland in the 90s was pushing so hard to be a member of this alliance, because it's a transatlantic alliance. Also, I think the United States presence and role in NATO is something that a lot of countries in Europe are also very much attached to. So in 2022, before the aggression, if you have asked me whether Finland and Sweden will be joining NATO soon, my answer would be no, because of course, they want to be in that specific situation, non-aligned countries in the EU but not in NATO. After 24th of February, it was a very clear and very fast political decision both in Stockholm and in Helsinki. They said no, in those circumstances, there is no other security guarantee than NATO. So for that reason, it's kind of self-evident that for Ukraine, being in NATO means that it will not be attacked by Russia in the future, or the chances of being attacked by Russia once again in the future are becoming slimmer and slimmer. It might sound cheesy, but NATO means security for countries like Poland and Ukraine.
To be sure, one of the unforeseen consequences of the full-scale invasion was Finland and Sweden discarding years and years of neutrality in favor of joining NATO. Certainly that was likely unforeseen by Vladimir Putin. I want to switch now to looking forward. You're in Brussels. You are busy with North Atlantic Council deliberations. I know the Secretary General is on the move in advance of the summit next month in Washington, trying to gain support and consensus for various decisions that will come out at the summit. From your point of view, what big decisions or commitments do you expect or anticipate NATO making at the Washington summit?
We are currently working in NATO on a package of measures for Ukraine, and they're both political and practical in nature, to make sure that we are not only committed to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia, but also we are bringing Ukraine closer to NATO, because as agreed by allies, Ukraine will become a member of NATO in the future. So currently we're working on three, I would say, big projects or political decisions that we are supposed to take at the Washington summit in July. The first one is with regards of increasing NATO's footprint in coordinating lethal and non-lethal support to Ukraine. We are very close to agreeing that, and very close to, in fact, moving NATO closer to what NATO should have been doing since 2022, which is coordinating allied support to Ukraine.
One of the key mechanisms for coordinating military assistance to Ukraine thus far has been the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, or UDCG, which was created in April 2022. The purpose of the UDCG is to support the defense of Ukraine by organizing the transfer of military aid and equipment in its fight against Russia. This is an ad hoc institutional framework which has been led by the United States and made up of all 32 NATO allies, the European Union, and about 24 other states. To find out more about Western military aid to Ukraine, I sat down with John Deni, a research professor of security studies at the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute, and Lisa Aronsson, a research fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University, who have been both studying European allied military support to Ukraine for a forthcoming report due out later this year.
Yeah, the UDCG, or Ukraine Defense Contract Group, was really an ad hoc grouping forum created by the U.S. in the immediate wake of the Russia's second invasion in February of 2022. And it's been meeting almost on a monthly basis in person nearly all the time, sometimes virtually, but typically in person at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. It's convened by the Secretary of Defense for himself and for his counterparts across not only NATO, but beyond NATO. There are over 50 countries that are members of the UDCG. They meet to coordinate their assistance, to learn the latest in terms of operations and what's unfolding on the ground in Ukraine. Ukrainian military staff typically, or general staff, typically attends these meetings. And there's an effort on the part of the United States and leading allies of this ad hoc coalition to try to use those meetings as almost forcing functions to try to convince allies and partners to bring more to the table each month to assist Ukraine in military terms, but also in a variety of other areas. Now, these meetings, they're political level meetings, right? I mentioned the SecDef, the American SecDef leads for the United States, and he's got counterparts there from across Europe and elsewhere. And often these meetings have kind of a almost a pro forma scripted kind of in the way they unfold, right? The characteristics of them, or the nature of them, is almost kind of scripted in a way, but they still form a really important function in terms of bringing all the players, the key donors, around the table at the same time with Ukrainians to understand what's really needed on the ground. And our quantitative analysis found that they do indeed make a small difference. It's not huge, but we found a limited but positive correlation between those meetings and the public pronouncements on donations of military assistance relative to other meetings and forums, such as defense ministerials held by NATO or EU meetings, that sort of a thing. So that they do matter. Now, whether they make a massive increase in the amount of aid that flows into Ukraine, I think that's open to debate. I don't think we found evidence of that. But they've nonetheless provided a pretty important forum for the United States and key allies to, again, gather around the table and learn what's needed and try to generate a response to that need.
The Ukraine Defense Contact Group has been a U.S.-led effort, but with the participation of 50 countries, as you have said, NATO members, but beyond NATO members as well. The NATO Secretary General has recently talked about an effort to bring the coordination of allied military support and tuck that under a NATO umbrella. And along with that, making arguments for increased pledges to Ukrainian assistance, whether it's military support or economic support otherwise. Why, in your view, John, is this happening now? And where does this effort stand?
Well, I think there's no avoiding the obvious that to some degree, the allies are concerned about one of our leading presidential candidates in this country has expressed, what we might describe as a complex relationship with the NATO alliance and made some comments in the past few months that for some Europeans have appeared to undermine deterrence. When I engage with European counterparts across the continent, they express great concern about that. And I think there's an effort to make the UDCG less reliant on the personal engagement and efforts of the American Secretary of Defense. One of the things we heard over and over in our interviews was the degree to which Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has been personally invested in this. From our perspective, that's to his great credit. But I think there's, another way to look at this is that if he's not there, will the UDCG in some way become diminished? Will the energy that goes into organizing it every month and into cajoling the allies to bring something to the table, will that diminish in some way? And so I think moving this into a NATO forum, a NATO-led forum, or putting it more under NATO's umbrella, I think would be a step toward depersonalizing it and enabling it to have some what we might think of as institutional longevity beyond the very ad hoc nature that characterizes it at this point.
Lisa, back to you. I wanted to ask about this effort, about perhaps bringing the Defense Contact Group under NATO, but also in your conversations with allied officials and my conversations that I've had with folks, is the issue of consensus within NATO and how NATO major decisions require allied consensus. In your discussions and interviews with officials, has that come up as a major an obstacle or a challenge, this idea of political cohesion and maintaining consensus within the alliance?
Absolutely. That's a challenge that the alliance has faced, ever since its founding. It's a consensus-based organization. And of course, the US and other European allies were actually relieved in a sense. We heard from this in our interviews that the alliance wasn't initially used in February of 2022 as a convening forum for the assistance, because the most important thing was delivering that assistance effectively and efficiently and as quickly as possible. And I think that's part of the reason why the US decided not to use this institution at the beginning, but to set up an ad hoc structure. The Brits also showed leadership in this area in order to help pivot quickly to supporting Ukraine. That was also a decision taken not to feed into Putin's narrative that NATO is party to this war, or that NATO is involved directly in this war, because of course this is a war that Russia has unleashed on Ukraine. So there was a deliberate effort to sidestep it at the beginning. And the need for effectiveness and efficiency and speed is still there. And I think, as John said, the proposal to shift the coordination role to NATO is an important one, because now we know that this is likely to be a longer-term conflict that requires this kind of institutional long-term commitment, not just from NATO delivering the coordination, but allies need to be delivering multi-year commitments. This we're seeing from a number of allies. Proposal actually from the Secretary General had three parts. First was that NATO would take over the coordination role of the UDCG, but of course it will still rely on U.S. enablers, the U.S. presence, the U.S. bandwidth. We're effectively the only ally that can deliver this coordination role and the enablers at the scale that's required. But the Secretary General also proposed a big multi-year financial pledge of military aid at 40 billion euros annually. And there are some details over how that will be funded, which allies will contribute what. And here again, the consensus issue will come up. And the other part of the proposal is, of course, around Ukraine's future membership in the alliance. There was, unfortunately, at the Vilnius summit last year, this issue came up with, you'll remember, Zelensky's anger in learning that Ukraine wouldn't be receiving an invitation to membership at that time.
What are the different types of military support that the European allies have provided to Ukraine so far in the war?
Building on what John said about the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, this is all at the sort of political level, but then, transitioning to the operational level, we might also just start out with the fact that this has been the operational support. The allies and partners have given materiel, sort of equipment, ammunition, training support, logistics, some operational support that has been more on the classified side. So in this study, we've stayed away from there. And also they've made efforts to try to draw some lessons in terms of what's worked, what hasn't worked, and then adjust their support from there. Initially, the coordination and the transfer of this support started out a little bit disjointed. The U.S. 18th Airborne Corps played a key role at the beginning. It was deployed to Poland as part of a troop buildup that was initially intended to reassure allies and deter Russia, and then possibly even to manage refugee flows coming out of Ukraine through Poland. But they ended up playing, quite unexpectedly, an important role helping transfer this material into Ukraine, military assistance into Ukraine. And from there, Poland has become one of the most important primary routes through which I think it's about 80% of international military assistance is delivered through Poland, including the airport in Rzeszów, but also through its railways.
Poland has played an important role in the Ukraine war since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. It has been a central staging area for the flow of Western arms and equipment into Ukraine, including from Poland's own stocks. On the humanitarian front, Poland has welcomed nearly 1 million Ukrainian refugees fleeing the war next door. However, the countries also share a complex history marked by disagreement. For example, Poland, along with a handful of other European Union members, have banned the import of Ukrainian grain to protect their own domestic markets. I talked with Dominik Jankowski to learn more about the role Poland has had in in Russia's war on Ukraine?
Polish support started already in February 2022. In fact, the first donation of ammunition started in December 2021 and then in January 2022. But then since the beginning of the aggression, basically, we were among the few allied countries that did not really impose any restrictions on what and how we are delivering support to Ukraine. So we were the first one to provide main battle tanks, of course, post-Soviet ones, but in numbers that exceeded any other ally back then in 2022. Over 350 tanks were provided to Ukraine directly from our own stocks and directly from our own units. So that's one. We were also the first ones to start the discussion about providing fighter jets. And of course, since 2022, we have provided a number of MiG-29s directly to Ukraine. They are already being used by the Ukrainian Air Force. And throughout those years, of course, once again, we were at this particular moment in history where we knew that we need to basically use our own resources directly from our own operational units and send them to Ukraine. So basically, there is nothing that we have not provided to Ukraine. Manpads, missile defense systems, armored vehicles, main battle tanks, fighter jets, millions of rounds of ammunition. One of the things that I would say we could have probably done better is how we stratcom those elements around. A lot of the elements that I'm telling you about were not publicly disclosed. The numbers are still classified. So basically, from time to time, of course, I'm under the impression that some allies are doing a lot of stratcom around, smaller number of weapons that they provided to. So look, I think we set the tone for allies back in 2022 on what could have been delivered to Ukraine in terms of high-end capabilities. And of course, the pace was important. I think March and April 2022 were decisive for Ukraine. And during those months and weeks, I think the Polish support played a key role.
Stratcom or strategic communications, as you say, from your view, what are the benefits or drawbacks of any country, Poland or any other country, from putting out into public the types of support that they're providing to Ukraine, whether specific weapon systems, specific platforms, versus the need and the desire to be more discreet about that?
I do believe that at this particular juncture of the war, I think we need to be more transparent of what we are providing. I mean, our citizens, our societies, after 2 years of that war, they expect us to be crystal clear what and how defense budget is being spent in support of Ukraine. So I see an important strategic communications benefit in terms of communicating with your own societies, be it within Europe or also in the transatlantic dimension. But also, I see a need to move towards a fair burden sharing between allies when it comes to supporting Ukraine. By the lack of transparency also creates a situation in which some allies are punching above their weight in terms of how much they are providing to Ukraine. The good example are the Baltic states, the three Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They have provided much more to Ukraine in comparison to their GDP than, other allies, much richer allies in Europe. So for that reason, I do believe it's important. Of course, the drawbacks are we need to make sure that we also communicate things in a certain moment of time, not to make Russian intelligence activities much easier when it comes to moving those goods through Allied and Ukrainian territory in terms of announcements of where those elements are going to be deployed, how the crews are going to be trained. So of course there is some level of secrecy that we would need as we go. But the overall goal, and I think that's also what we are trying to do in NATO right now, is to make sure that we have more transparency, which leads also to a fair burden sharing when it comes to support of Ukraine.
Other allies have provided really important logistics roles as well, and redundancy especially, Romania and others have chosen to deliver their support in a much more quiet way for reasons that have to do with their own national security, threat perceptions, and their strategic cultures. But the Allies have delivered a huge range of military support, from equipment to logistics, operational, training, intelligence, just about across the board. Aside, of course, from boots on the ground.
John, I'll come back to you. So what has worked in terms of Allied support, and what can be done better, both allies, individual allies, and as a whole in supporting Ukraine?
Rick, that's a good question. We didn't dive into the details of the efficacy of the assistance effort. That was a question we actually asked in our semi-structured interviews for each of the case studies. What are the allies doing to measure their effectiveness? How do they know what they're doing is effective or not? Where they need to do more, where they need to maybe to do less, frankly, few of the allies have any kind of robust measures of effectiveness. Not even the U.S. Now, there are lots of lessons learned, or maybe I should say lessons identified, processes, some of which have unfolded since the very earliest days of the war. But in terms of measures of effectiveness, the tools that allies are using to determine what's working, what's not, in terms of materiel or the kinds of training we're offering, that kind of a thing, they're pretty blunt. By some, according to some that we spoke with, it's as simple as, meters or kilometers gained on the battlefield. But that's not really a good indication that gives the allies a sense of where refinements need to occur. Now, there are a variety, aside from the very obvious, how far is Ukraine advancing in the battlefield? There are a variety of informal feedback loops that are occurring, though. So, for example, most of the allies and partners that are donating to Ukraine, they've got embassy staff in Kyiv. And so they get some feedback there in capital from political officials of the Ukrainian government, but also from their contacts on the general staff. In some cases, some of the allied officers that are working to provide assistance, they've got friends in Ukraine among Ukrainian military officers and staff. And so they're able to get feedback informally in that way. We also have seen evidence of some of the private contractors that are on the ground in Ukraine providing maintenance support, that sort of thing. I'm thinking specifically of Rheinmetall, German manufacturer. They've got a presence in Ukraine. Now, they're not on the front line, right? They're not seeing what's happening in terms of the tactics and techniques and procedures used by Ukrainians, but they are receiving damaged Ukrainian equipment. And so they can infer from that the kinds of success, the degree of success that Russians are having in thwarting the use of Western military equipment. So that provides again, a kind of an indirect feedback loop into the West so we can better refine the kinds of equipment that we're providing to the Ukrainians. I think, this is one of the challenges that we deal with across the security cooperation realm, if you will, not merely with regard to what we're doing in Ukraine, but certainly what we've seen in the last couple of decades in Afghanistan and Iraq. Our inability to really have robust measures of effectiveness for our security cooperation has in many ways limited the efficacy of that cooperation, those efforts to provide equipment and training. We can't claim to have this right in the U.S., and certainly the evidence that Lisa and I uncovered in our study, through our interviews especially, indicates our allies haven't figured this out either.
Maintaining Allied political cohesion on the continuation of Western military aid to Ukraine will be a top concern among the policymakers and officials attending the upcoming NATO summit. Another crucial agenda item is the topic of Ukraine's future membership in the alliance, which has been a very long time in the making. I asked all of my guests what they expect to be on the table during the summit meeting in Washington next month.
We are currently working in NATO on a package of measures for Ukraine, and they're both political and practical in nature, to make sure that we are not only committed to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia, but also we are bringing Ukraine closer to NATO, because as agreed by allies, Ukraine will become a member of NATO in the future. The first one is with regards of increasing NATO's footprint in coordinating lethal and non-lethal support to Ukraine. We are very close to agreeing that, and very close to, in fact, moving NATO closer to what NATO should have been doing since 2022, which is coordinating allied support. The second part of that of those discussions that we are having right now is how we can pledge financially to support Ukraine. And there is this discussion about the famous 40 billion euros that Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has been talking about. So basically pledging a certain amount by all allies and make that commitment a long-term one. This will be a difficult discussion. As of course, some allies prefer more flexibility in terms of how and what they deliver to Ukraine, and they're not in favor of long-term financial commitments due to also, of course, changes of governments in European countries. This is an important discussion that allies will still have to work on, but I do believe we'll have a decision in principle about a certain amount of money that allies will pledge to support Ukraine military, for example, over, let's say, the next year. And after that, we'll review that and look whether we need to change it. And finally, we need to also make a step forward when it comes to bringing Ukraine closer politically to NATO. So last year at the NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania, we agreed that, of course, Ukraine will become the member of the alliance. That's nothing new in all frankness. We have been saying that since 2008, so since the NATO summit in Bucharest, Romania. But so we are currently looking at formulas that are going to make that Ukrainian path towards NATO irreversible in its nature, and looking for any solutions, political solutions that are going to build that bridge between where Ukraine is right now and the end state, which is Ukraine's membership in this alliance. But this is also going to be a difficult discussion, as of course some allies very clearly say there will not be an invitation for Ukraine to join NATO at the summit in Washington.
And any invitation on the political front, of course, would entail a consensus among all 32 allies, correct?
That's correct. Every single ally would have to agree to do that. And we are not there yet. So I as I said, I suspect that rather at the summit in Washington, we will be showing progress and making sure that Ukraine stays on that irreversible path towards NATO without inviting Ukraine to join the alliance. That would have to be decided later on and discussed later on.
The Washington summit won't be a membership summit either. The terms I've heard are, let's offer Ukraine a quote-unquote bridge to membership that involves both practical and political commitments, and identifying and presenting a clear path for Ukraine's future within NATO. And of course, it remains to be seen what specifically will be included in that quote-unquote bridge to membership, and whether it will deliver the, as John said, the institutional longevity and sort of the commitments that Ukraine needs.
I want to turn the page here now to U.S. national security. What are the implications of your findings for the United States and for U.S. defense strategy?
So in the latter half of our paper, we look at what the implications of our findings are for U.S. defense strategy. And we divide that up. We look at that in sort of three different lenses. The first has to do with escalation risk. We've seen that this kind of cuts both ways for the U.S. On one hand, there are risks associated with some of our allies being more forward-leaning, like the United Kingdom or Poland, because, of course, we have Article 5 commitments to those allies. But we also learned in our interviews that to some degree, these more forward-leaning allies have been of benefit to us because we're able to sort of learn from what they're able to do with Ukraine. We're able to leverage these allies' more permissive authorities. We also looked at the implications for U.S. defense strategy from a burden-sharing perspective. As of July of last year, Europeans had actually overtaken the United States in all areas of support to Ukraine, including military support. But of course, now we know this is likely to be a longer term conflict, and we'll have to continue or even raise the level of military support to Ukraine. So there are risks for the United States associated with whether or not European allies can deliver on those commitments, especially in the short term. And the third area that we looked at had to do with U.S. leadership and posture in Europe. And across the board, we heard from all of the allies close to the eastern flank and further to the west that the U.S. presence still matters. The U.S. troop presence on the ground and the enablers still matter for both the capacity to deliver command and control for all the assistance going into Ukraine, but also for reassuring allies that we've got their backs, because they need to take some more risks for their own national security in delivering more military assistance to Ukraine in the short term.
John, can you give us just a snapshot for folks who may not be familiar with it, just kind of the scale and the presence of U.S. military footprint supporting this effort in Ukraine, in the European theater?
Yeah, the footprint is fairly significant. Of course, it's grown since February 2022. Lisa and I had a chance in our interviews to visit Wiesbaden, which is kind of the center of gravity in Germany for the American effort, at least from a command and control perspective. And there, in the war's earliest days, the U.S. set up sort of an ad hoc security assistance group, Ukraine. Lisa mentioned how it was born out of the 18th Airborne Corps initially. And U.S. Army Europe ended up providing a lot of the manpower, a lot of the personnel for that initial ad hoc SAGU entity. It has since then gone through a kind of a revitalization. It's been redesigned, and now it's got a structure of just over 400 people, consisting mostly of Americans, but there's also a sizable European allied presence or element in that SAGU, especially British personnel. And so there's a large contingent, as I mentioned now, at Wiesbaden. There's also, of course, American efforts to help move the material through Ramstein that comes from across the ocean and get that into Poland. And so the elements of the U.S. Logistics backbone, led by the 21st Theater Sustainment Command, based in Germany, are assisting with that, as are other active units that are forward stationed over in Europe. So the effort that the Americans have undertaken here is significant. And I think although our European allies, especially the Brits, have expressed some willingness to step in if the Americans can't fulfill this leadership role, I don't think Lisa and I, nor even the Brits, think they have the capacity, the scale to do this in the way the Americans have. You know, one thing that our military is really expert at, and it's been this way for decades, really since the earliest years of the Cold War, is being able to move military personnel and material around the world. We've got an ocean on either side. Our ability to get people and things worldwide is really second to none in the world, and certainly in the alliance. And we've really leveraged that in the European context, being able to move the material at scale across the ocean first, through Ramstein and other airports of entry, and then into Poland and other neighboring countries and onward into Ukraine has been significant. And that really can't be replicated by any European ally.
Lisa, back over to you. Looking forward, looking into the future, where do you see European allied support to Ukraine go from here? What can be done better?
None of the allies, the big ones, the UK, Germany, or France, could have the capacity that we have. But one British scholar told me that from his perspective, the UK, France, and Germany could develop the capacity to do this if they could overcome some of the long-known hurdles that we know around European defense cooperation on the strategy side, the industrial side, etc. So this long-term conflict is affordable for European economies, and there is capacity. It's about figuring out how to make sure that it delivers more than the sum of its parts. We also make recommendations that have to do with strengthening forward-based military and civilian resources that are important for reassurance in the NATO context, as well as for the coordination and communication that's required with allies across the continent. It is going to be a long-term conflict, so we encourage the European adoption of defense production laws and regulations that could enable government direction of defense production priorities in peacetime, in limited circumstances, of course. And then finally, we have a series of recommendations that have to do with learning from one another, better engaging allied personnel in the U.S. national security establishment, especially those with experiences in places and contexts that are off limits to American personnel. Of course, this involves more sharing of intelligence and information, and in better engaging with Ukrainian war veterans, especially those that are no longer able to serve on active duty, to help improve the training realism at allied training facilities, both to improve training for Ukrainians, but also to learn from them and improve training for our own forces.
Next time on The Ties That Bind, NATO at 75 and Beyond.
In the beginning, I met Vladimir Putin. Even NATO expansion and NATO enlargement. Putin didn't like it, but he said in an official resume of our meeting, every nation should finally be free to choose its own destiny.
Security is the key to keeping investments and trade flows going. Without security, our economy would be damaged too. Without security in Europe. So I think that's a very important reason to continue to support NATO and continue to provide the military capabilities to keep it strong and keep the deterrence credible.
Keep in mind, that joining an international military alliance like the U.S. did, like all the allies did in 1949, this was really a revolutionary foreign policy move for the United States.
This has been The Ties That Bind, NATO at 75 and Beyond, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. The complete interviews with all of our guests are available in the link in the description of this episode. For more podcasts, analysis, and to learn about upcoming events, please visit us at fpri.org.